So, hello. My name is Alexander Bierg, and along with the other co-organizers, I'd like to welcome you to today, the 10th edition of Cambridge Talks, which is the annual conference coordinated by the PhD students in the program in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Planning here at the Graduate School of Design. This year's conference was organized by a large contingent of the current second and third year students, and we're extremely excited for the presentations and discussions we have scheduled today. I'd like to offer a few opening thoughts for today's proceedings, but first we'd like to thank a number of individuals and organizations that have helped make today possible. Our conference this year was supported by several grants from the Harvard GSD, from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and yesterday's PhD colloquium was supported by a grant from the Graduate Student Council. We also received generous support from different departments in the school, and we'd like to thank in particular Iñaki Avalos, Anita Beres-Beitia, and Chantal Blakely for their support. We also could not have organized today without the help of Jen Swartout and Liz Thorntonson, who are essential in keeping us on track logistically. And we also want to thank Michael Hayes and Erica Naginski, who provided much needed feedback and support in developing today's conference themes. And so, what are those themes? Why utopia? This is almost a ludicrously broad question, one that attaches itself to any mention of that strange and dangerous word, as we saw yesterday in the PhD colloquium. We had initially thought of this conference on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia, which was first published in 1516, and my colleague Manuel Lopez will provide some thoughts on More's Utopia in his introduction to this afternoon's panel. But as we developed the broader conference themes, we realized we were more specifically concerned with what we have called Utopia's modern guise, experiments that occurred over the past 2.5 centuries or so that have envisioned social speculation through spatial mediation and configuration. In other words, the modern utopia might be understood as the encounter of ideals and environments, social and technological, embodied and disembodied, or bound and unbound. The crucial aspect of these modern encounters with utopia is that they brought about the terror of realization. This tension was expressed in typically disarming terms by Theodor Adorno when he wrote, quote, "The cliché which claims that modern technology has fulfilled the fantasies of fairy tales only ceases to be a cliché if one adds that the fulfillment of wishes rarely benefits those who make them. The right way of wishing is the most difficult art of all. Utopias have been realized only to disabuse human beings of any utopian desire and commit them all the more thoroughly to the status quo." That is to say, the large and probably unanswerable problem that lies beneath today's conference is the question of why utopia remains such a beguiling subject, even as we have learned Adorno's lesson repeatedly. Yet totalizing visions are invariably subject to compromise, failure, abuse, and human and environmental suffering. With that larger concern in the background, I'd like to pose 4 opening questions to today's discussions, with the hope that these might draw some similarities, connections, and points of dialogue among today's set of case studies. So the first question is in regard to the site, which is in our title. That is, where and when is utopia? How reliant or ignorant is a utopian construct upon its historical and locational constraints? The second question is about scale. How big is utopia, and what is its scale of operation? And how does a utopia fit into the famous categories proposed by Charles Darwin of lumpers and splitters? Is the utopian imagination necessarily one that lumps things together into a kind of aggregated total system? Or can we imagine a utopian imaginary that splits, that divides activities, social formations, techniques, and spaces into ever finer categories? Different presentations today will look to objects that might be considered utopian, a stove or a solar house, in which the thought seems to be deductive and emergent, that if we make enough stoves or solar houses, a utopia might emerge. Other systems are instead inductive, the electrical grid or state regulation, that modulate human realities from a distance view, which is all to repeat, how big is utopia, and how does the logic of scale intersect with a particular social ideal? The third question is about authorship and its supports. Who is allowed to imagine a utopia, and is the utopian imagination inextricable from questions of social power and even dominance? And the fourth and last question poses a larger historical problem with our topic today, and it's about intentionality. That is, are utopias intentional? Or do they emerge, like most things, from a combination of momentum and accidents, from misunderstandings and mutations? We ask this in a moment in which the possibilities of coherent social, technological, and ecological imagination seem tenuous and even distant in the face of political dissolution and environmental emergency. In other words, while we know that utopia is not simply a problem or a solution, has it been more productive than destructive as a concept? And is there a point in trying to keep score? As with most historical questions, our interest today arises out of these present-day uncertainties. And while this conference will probably not resolve these concerns, though today, right now, we can kind of hope that they will, perhaps we can raise a few new questions to the discussion. And so with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Maria Atuesta, who will provide an introduction for the first panel.
Tall. Okay. I'm tiny. So thank you, Alec, for this wonderful introduction. As most of you know, I'm Maria Atuesta. I'm a student here at the Graduate School of Design. And so before we start with this great panel, I just wanted to introduce what we mean by embodied utopias. So to start this discussion, it is useful to draw on Mannheim's notion of utopia and his distinction between utopias and ideologies. As opposed to ideology, utopia is defined as a state of mind that transcends social realities, not to confirm and legitimate the social order, but to transform the status quo and break the bonds of existing social order. Although the obsession with utopia has been associated with the need to think of alternative ways out to a better world, Mannheim's conceptualization does not necessarily evoke a dream of immaculate perfection. It rather evokes rupture and transformation, and invites us to shift the gaze towards the messy nature of social change. From this standpoint, we invite our speakers to reflect on utopias as the embodiment of a process involved on the production of new social orders. So embodiments take place in this panel through the reconstruction of state territories, domesticity, and productive labor, serving the purpose of reshaping everyday bodily interactions. The examples discussed here, which are situated in Mexico, Peru, the United States, and the colony of French Guiana, consider how principles of social reorganization were envisioned and enacted in the very geography of the building, the body, and the plantation. In each case, utopias are intricately historical and invite us to reflect on the conditions of possibility of each historical period. Today, we might be inclined to ask, what are the political, intellectual, and economic structures that both inspired and inhibited the imaginations of new social orders? What is embodied about utopias? And can we think of embodiments as a useful research concept? So in this session, our guest speakers will first present their work, and then we will open it up for discussions and questions. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. We have Professor Luis Castañeda here with us. He's assistant professor of art history at Syracuse University. His teaching and research focuses on the history of art and architecture in the Americas and examines the visual culture and urban history of the region in relation to economic, political, and intellectual transformations during the 20th century. With persistent interest in understanding the connections between the practice of architecture and the practice of politics, his book, Spectacular Mexico, studies the design projects of the 1968 Olympics and how this influenced social and geopolitical transformations in Mexico. Today, he will take us in a journey from Mexico to Peru, examining the relationship between infrastructural schemes, spectacular events, and mythological narratives of state-sponsored architectural ventures in both countries. So please, Luis, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here. And I guess I'm just wondering how this works technically. How do I scroll between the slides? Sorry, this is, I did not.
You move the slides with this.
Ah, perfect.
One of these.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's not part of the talk. So, the talk starts with the 19th issue of which we're looking at, of the Informative Bulletin of Mexico's Ministry of Public Works from December 1955, which is a commemorative edition devoted to the life and works of an architect called Carlos Lazo. Lazo attained a level of political visibility really without precedence for any architect of his generation. A couple of years before 1955, before this appeared, he had been appointed by then President of Mexico, Miguel Alemán, as Minister of Public Works. In November 1955, however, he died tragically in an airplane crash that shook the architectural establishment of the country and of the region. Throughout his career, which was short but very intense, he had been especially interested in matters of infrastructure. And he concerned himself, especially with designing at a territorial scale of intervention unthinkable for many of his contemporaries. So fittingly, the volume I'm mentioning focused on the multiple works of this magnitude that he had sponsored, among them the many land, air, and waterways to which this evocative image refers. And in particular, the bottom photograph resonates with this is kind of a morose thing to say, the rather spectacular circumstances of his death. I mean, it's weird to say that someone's death is spectacular, but this death is pretty spectacular for an architect. This architect died while on an airplane that was flying over Mexico City, and before that he had the airplane redesigned, custom designed, so that it would have this glass underbelly, so that he could literally design on a territorial scale from the plane more effectively while moving on a territory. So he could walk on the underbelly of the plane and see everything as he moved on a plane over a place. Which gives you, I mean, this is like, you know, every modern architect's kind of dream death in a way. The plane crashed over Lake Texcoco on the outskirts of the capital, and it actually malfunctioned tragically in part because of this glass underbelly redesign. So be careful what you kind of wish for. But the most significant project that he was involved with before this was, of course, the famous University City of Mexico City, finished in 1953, of which he was not the architect of record, but the general manager. From this important position, overseeing the work of about 60 teams of architects in what was then the largest publicly sponsored building campaign in Mexico's modern history, he pushed for a series of design changes on the campus throughout the whole process. And for many architects who were involved with this project, he was its unrecognized author. Indeed, we're looking at these clippings of right after he died, which show that many of these architects attempted to recognize him as the actual author of the campus, over and above the architects of record for the University City, who of course are Mario Pani and Enrique del Moral. And there is indeed a case to be made for Lazo's at least co-authorship of the city. But what is uncontestable, aside from that other question, is that he conceived of the project for the campus in really ambitious and really understudied terms. And this is expressed in a sketch I'm showing you, which is entitled, very ambitiously, Planning on a World Scale. And the globe that we see here shows Mexico at the center of what looks like this maelstrom of circulating knowledge, capital, commodities, geopolitical influence, which is represented by these intersecting, swirling red lines. And if we look closer in this detail, the actual precise location of the intersection of all these lines is not only Mexico City, but more specifically the University City, to the south of the city. So the campus is this core of an imagined, recalibrated world which has Mexico as its uncontestable center of attraction, right? In the speech that Lazo gave when the cornerstone for the University City was laid in 1950, he reinforces this continental perception of the project. He claims that, quote, the campus was placed at the center of the continent, at a frontier point of two races and two cultures, in the capital of the country where everybody converges, on the Pan-American Highway, the axis of America, which extends its arms to join together the Indo-Latin to the Anglo-American culture, and realizes in our territory the basic continental synthesis. I don't know how he said all this in one sentence, but he did. That of the humanism, which is not even over, that of the humanism of classical culture and the scientific and dynamic knowledge of our time. That's what he said when the cornerstone was laid. So Lasso imagines the campus as a site of these almost like cosmic cultural fusions, which, of course, earlier generations of intellectuals in Mexico, like the famous or infamous José Vasconcelos, had already enshrined as a powerful component of Mexico's national myth of cultural exceptionalism. Mexico is a place based on this fusion of cultures at the center of the continent. And part of the reason why the death of this architect was so tragic was that his desire, which he never concealed, to run for president. An ambitious but very likely prospect, given his connections to power, and a prospect that many of his fellow architects looked upon with trepidation in some cases and with joy in others, as a prospect that could potentially elevate the political profile of their entire professional class. Of course, he died, so this didn't happen. But in the years that followed his death, one of his closest pupils, his most closest kind of associate, who's his architect we're looking at, Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, he did rise through the political ranks of Mexico, and he did kind of occupy a series of important government positions, including that of chief organizers of the 1968 Olympics held in the Mexican capital. So from this position, which he kind of inherits from the mentor, Ramirez Vázquez worked to materialize one part of that ambitious diagram of planning on the world scale that I'm going to discuss, the first one, I'm going to discuss two, through this carefully orchestrated movement, which we're looking at now, of the Olympic torch between Olympia, Greece, and Mexico City in time for the inauguration of that athletic event. So we're looking at this diagram of the movement of the torch, which left Greece, moved through the Iberian Peninsula, and then arrived to Veracruz, and then eventually made its way to the Central Valley of Mexico, towards the capital city. On the way, this torch made a stop in San Salvador, which is the alleged place where Columbus first saw land in the New World. So the trajectory obviously retraces Columbus's journey circa 1492, and then the movement of the artifact inside of Mexico's national space from Veracruz, the port, to the capital city recalls the conquest of Mexico by Hernán Cortés's forces a few decades after Columbus's journeys. So what this trajectory of the torch really does is that it celebrates this history of colonization, of mixture, of cultural fusions, as a kind of preamble for the mythology of Mexico's cultural fusions as its national myth. And it situates the capital city as the temporary center of this Olympic spectacle, doing two things at the same time. It reclaims, if only ephemerally, the centrality of the city to the geographies of the transatlantic Spanish Empire, of which it once was the center, and of the Aztec Empire, of which it also was the center that preceded that other empire. So there's a lot going on in the movement of this torch, but in particular, if we look at this comparison, we see that there's a part of that diagram of influence that the movement of the torch fulfills, if only temporarily, if only spectacularly, for just a short moment in time. There's the penultimate stop of the torch. Before the torch arrives to the Olympic Stadium at that University City campus I have mentioned, on October 12th, Columbus Day, it arrives at the pre-Hispanic site of Teotihuacan, which are these great pyramids now on the outskirts of Mexico City, the previous night. So this happens October 11th. And there's an elaborate performance there that greets the torch. It involves over 1,000 dancers. It commemorates the arrival of the torch. And the performance itself is a revival of the New Fire ceremony, which is a celebration that took place every 52 years at the beginning of a new agricultural cycle in Mesoamerica, so in pre-Hispanic Mexico. The Olympic torch first is lit on top of one of these pyramids, and the next morning it's lit on top of the Olympics, at the top of this stand in the Olympic Stadium. And there's this connection, of course, between ancient and modern architecture in this movement. And this connection between ancient and modern architecture is already contained in the form of this stadium itself. The stadium famously recalls the origins of this vast lava bed on which the entire campus rests, which was the result of the eruption of a volcano sometime in the 3rd to 4th century CE. And as you can see, this stadium is built out of the excavated bedrock of its site. This bedrock is then repurposed for its retaining walls, and then it has this crater-like form that recalls this formative geological scenario. The movement of the torch between ancient buildings and this modern building that looks like an ancient building is represented across various media. For example, in these graphics, in these postage stamps, which are part of this very ambitious graphic campaign for these Olympics. On the left, we see one of these postage stamps commemorating the New Fire ceremony I was describing, with the torch on the top of that pyramid. And on the right, we're looking at that iridescent yellow detail placed at the origin point of the red and green radiating patterns, which pinpoints the location of the torch as installed at the Olympic Stadium. Therefore, the travels of the torch temporarily actualize Lasso's idea of that campus as a site of a continental synthesis, as a point of cultural encounters between the Olympic imaginations from the West and these pre-Hispanic nationalist revivals and these mythological understandings of Mexico produced in that country. So there is a way in which this movement of the torch, which is just part of a bigger architectural project, but is kind of a project in its own right, actualizes one fragment of that large-scale planning that Lasso was envisioning for his campus. So there's architects like Ramirez Vázquez and Pani who come very close to political power circles in Mexico, but there are no architects in Mexico who manage to fulfill Lasso's level of presidential ambition. There is, however, a contemporary of all these architects, an architect on the right called Fernando Belaunde, who was the president of Peru not once but twice. First between 63 and 68, and then again between 80 and 85. He's covered on the right in the cover, he's pictured on the right in the cover of Time magazine, which is a rare honor for any architect, really. And he was trained in the US in the 30s at UT Austin, and then he returned to his country of origin and rose to prominence as a kind of ally to US interests at a particularly heated Cold War moment. There's this kind of loose connection between these two architects, but there's also a more direct connection. In fact, the sketch on the right, it directly prefigures the infrastructure project that that architect who becomes president twice uses essentially as his tool to become a president. And it's a highway. There's a diagram on the right of those kind of influence routes through the South American landmass, which the highway on the left kind of attempts to actualize. And the highway on the left was meant to be this core of an infrastructural network meant to urbanize the area between the Andean mountain range and the Amazon rainforest, and to connect, as we're seeing in that image, a series of trade posts throughout the South American landmass. And this is directly, as I said, prefigured in the detail on the right, where in both cases there's this piece of imagined infrastructure that serves to connect these geographies of influence. Both of them avoid the central part of the continent, the Amazon itself, and they connect together a number of coastal trade stops, which are essentially left over from the Spanish-American and Luso-Brazilian imperial geographies of the past. The highway project we're seeing on the left was the center of the campaign for this architect. It was promoted widely, including in this book called The Conquest of Peru by Peruvians of 1959. There it is on the right, that's the back of the book, showing the highway as the central kind of promise of the presidential ticket for this architect. And in that book, the highway is not only described as a kind of heir to the mythical road system of the Inca Empire, which is there on the right, to which it is compared directly, but also to the equally mythical works of infrastructure of the continental United States that this architect openly admired, and in which he conflated everything here. And he had this idea of reviving not only in a kind of Pan-American sense, not only the Inca experience or this mythical Inca experience, but also this American experience as in the US, in large part because of his training in the 30s in this great era in this country of public works of infrastructure. So in addition to these precedents, there's something else going on that highway that connects it very clearly to what happens around the same time in the construction of things like Brasilia, which of course is much more than the creation of a monumental city, or was supposed to be much more than the creation of one city. Brasilia, as you see on the right, was actually conceived as an internal colonization effort meant to repopulate the plateau on which the capital sits. And as the image shows very directly, it was supposed to function as this kind of metaphorical launching pad with those little planes for Brazil's own imagined, and I should say very imperial, geographies of world influence. This highway, which seems completely, kind of chimeric in its scale and unrealizable, actually is built in reality. The first stage is built by a U.S. conglomerate called TAMS, Tippett, Abbots, McCarthy, Stratton, this infrastructure firm that first started becoming important when it built infrastructure for the U.S. military around the world after World War II. And it took this created this preliminary study for the highway, which is supported, as we can see, by the governments not only of Peru, but also of Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador. And eventually this list of governments came to include Paraguay, Brazil, and Uruguay in the following years. And on the right, we see the original design of the highway with this, the marginal highway is this vertical connector in the image, which is supplemented by these penetration roads which traverse the mountains of the Andes, and these other transversal roads meant to serve as nodes of urbanization throughout the region that the highway serves. So there's this repopulation idea, there's this kind of trade facilitation idea, and there is this idea also of urbanizing the part of the, a part of the country which would alleviate the population of the coast. And that's actually a really important part of what this whole highway is supposed to be doing. In almost every way, Belaúnde's administration, a lesson to architects, is fairly disastrous. Not least because there's biting opposition to every one of his measures, especially this very costly highway, which is lambasted by many of the time as too utopian a scheme to be ever realized. However, even after he is ousted from power by a coup, by the military regime of Juan Velasco Alvarado, whom we're looking at in these pictures, this regime, which is opposed to Belaúnde, continues to build the highway with transnational support until its end in 1980. And after 1980, the highway continues to be built even more during the second government of this architect. And in fact, this highway is still being kind of built in the present. And this aerial photograph shows us one stretch of the highway, which is intended not only to create this conduit for the trade of commodities, and these are all, of course, extraction territories for a number of resources, but it's also meant, in theory, to establish these nodes of urbanization along the way in this otherwise very sparsely populated region. There's many events in between this temporal span that lead to the return of this architect to the presidency of Peru, which happens as the military regime ends its rule over the country. But there's one event that is really important for a couple of reasons, and that is the declaration of the Machu Picchu Charter, which happens in 1977 on this famous Inca site. And that's the picture of the first reading of this charter, the archives for which, I should say, are here at the GSD. Belaúnde is one of the primary supporters of this encounter of architects, intellectuals, thinkers, which does get quite a bit of interest from a wide range of sectors in the architectural establishment of the world. But he's not actually there at the meeting when this is read, because he's still banned from entering the country by the military regime that ousted him, and he's still in exile at that time in the US. I think specifically at that time he was teaching here, in between here and Colombia, I believe. The charter is signed next to the famous, this famous monolith, the Intihuatana, which is at the center of this gathering, and it's the monument that is in this picture and had also provided the cover for that earlier book of the architect, which I showed you from 1959. And the idea of this charter is that it's meant to override many of the urban principles of the formative Athens Charter, and it aims to establish Machu Picchu, not the ancient Greek capital, as a kind of new paradigm for late 20th century urbanism and architecture. And it's again meant to reshift the center of an imagined world to this new location in the margins. There's many flaws that the charter has as a document, but it's significant on at least two fronts. One is that it introduces questions of sustainability into the architectural conversation. And more importantly, it's a really key event in establishing this architect that I've been talking about and reestablish him, not only as a player in the architectural scene, but also as a viable political contender in the elections that haven't yet been announced by 77, but which are already in the horizon. So it's an important event because it also mobilizes support for this architect who's trying to return to the presidency for the second time. And this return could be seen as a kind of success story that confirms the political viability of architecture as a force for social and territorial organization in this part of the world. And indeed, this return to power by the architect who's first ousted by a military regime is widely perceived as a kind of visionary commitment, and particularly because of its focus on this kind of infrastructure. And there is this sense in the early stages of this regime, and this is the spread from Time magazine from 1965, that there's this excitement about what the highway is going to do. In particular, in this case, from the US perspective, there is a spread here of all the commodities that with a lot of excitement, the article claims, are going to circulate more freely than ever before through the South American landmass and around the world. And then there's bananas and oil and all these other commodities that are extremely important, of course, in the US imagination of the Cold War. And of course, this particular version of the future of a free market, deregulated, US-friendly prosperity, as it never has happened, never materialized. But the marginal highway that was built was actually essential to the consolidation of a different, maybe more dystopian trade of a whole other range of commodities that also have the US as their primary market, but are not quite celebrated in the same way. Indeed, during the 80s and 90s, one particular stretch of this highway, which is in the remote part of Peru, it's called Campanilla, this location, in the center of the valley that still produces the largest amount of coca leaf and by extension cocaine in the world, was famously used by drug lord Pablo Escobar on the left as a clandestine landing strip during his regular trips to Peru to transport his product and oversee his global operations. So the highway that this architect had built actually became the runway in the middle of the jungle for Pablo Escobar, of course, who everyone knows who he is, I'm assuming, who would land here routinely and transport, and from here oversee the geography of production for his empire. And on the top right, that is the bombed out highway at one point in time when they bombed it out to prevent planes from landing. And this happened, of course, with the kind of tacit or even open approval of every authority you can imagine. So there's this use of the highway as infrastructure for the cocaine trade, which reveals less kind of a design flaw of the project as such, and more what happens when there's a case of chronically underserved infrastructure, which is produced without an apparatus of support that it requires to fulfill its stated mission. So then, in lieu of this, what happens is that the kind of deregulation forces create a whole other market that uses the same patchwork infrastructure for its own purposes. So there's a lesson here because the plane that Lasso was on never managed to fulfill the epic future of architecture and infrastructure promises for this continent. But far away from Mexico, in the depths of the Amazon, in the space of actualization of another part of Lasso's continental plan, there was another plane, Escobar's plane, which fulfilled a dystopian version of the same promise. And in this different version, the world's geographies of influence were actually recalibrated in a way that placed the Americas at center stage of a world phenomenon, and to a degree that no architect of the past century, even the most ambitious one, could have ever possibly imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. So our second speaker for this panel is Joyce Chaplin. She is the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History at Harvard. She is a historian of culture and a historian of science, interested in the intersections between humans and nature. She is a prolific scholar and an award-winning author. Her most recent book is Roundabout the World, is a history of circumnavigation and humans' centuries-old obsession with circling the world. She has been writing on a variety of topics that exceed the bounds of traditional historical research and is known for addressing these topics with incisive wit and intellect. I'm sure we will get a bit of this today in her talk, which is entitled Poor Richard's Climate, Body, Comfort, and Conservation in the Little Ice Age. So welcome, Professor Chaplin.
Thank you so much. If I knew I had to be witty this early in the morning, I would have practiced harder. I just want to make sure I can advance the slides with just the top button or the one to the side? The big one. Huh. Thank you so much for organizing this conference and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very grateful, even though I work nearby and at Harvard, it does seem like a kind of cultural and physical trek to come to the GSD, and it's always a very, very welcome one, so thank you very much. And so to some utopian thoughts from the late Enlightenment. In the winter of 1768, two elderly philosophers revisited the question of human felicity. Henry Home, Lord Kames, then in his 70s, wrote to his friend Benjamin Franklin, then in his 60s, that I begin to perceive in my decline of life that happiness, comfort at least, depends more upon what a philosopher would call slight conveniences than a young man in the ardor of his studies is apt to imagine. I have long been of an opinion similar to that you express, Franklin responded, and think happiness consists more in small conveniences or pleasures that occur every day than in great pieces of good fortune that happen but seldom. Interestingly, the comfort both men had in mind was a steady source of heat in winter. Given that the two elderly philosophers lived at a time of climatic cooling, the convenience of indoor heating was neither slight nor small, despite their disclaimers. Moreover, Franklin knew he was living in an era of climate change, in response to which he designed a heating system and to which he articulated a climate science. Two projects that he managed to connect to each other in a convincing way. Despite the ongoing and crucial recovery of evidence about historic climate change, there's been little attention to how people in the past were aware of the changes, let alone that they might have responded creatively to them. As a result, there's a marked contrast between what we claim to know about climate now and what people in the past supposedly did not know. That contrast is dependent on our instrumental definition of climate and climate change, and the instrument in question here is the thermometer, which has generated consistent data about climate, but only since the 19th century. For earlier eras, and in contrast, historians and climate scientists have used proxy data, so dendrochronological evidence, ice cores, and so on, in order to establish climatological baselines. Some scholars have read these proxies against contemporary human records of meteorological events, though often to emphasize the recorder's seeming lack of comprehension of any larger trend. Before the 19th century, therefore, it's thought that people knew about weather, short-term variation and fluctuations, but they're not supposed to know, let alone theorize about climate, long-term atmospheric trends and patterns that may have extended beyond their lifetimes. Now, it is true that people in the pre-modern global West relied on static definitions of climate. The classical tradition of geography used climate synonymously with latitude, dividing the globe among discrete bands of differently heated regions, hottest at the equator, and then cooling as they shaded off into the poles. Pre-modern scientific texts did assume that climates had not changed since antiquity, so the globe was stable in terms of its bands of climate and had not changed, possibly for centuries, if not millennia. Wider exploration of the world, however, and particularly the so-called European discovery of the Americas, had begun to raise questions about classical geography and this planetary understanding, including climate. The North American places that Europeans began to describe were distinctly colder than their European latitudinal counterparts, for example. So it's sobering or interesting in this way to recall that Massachusetts is on a latitude with certain parts of the Mediterranean, yet does not produce grapes or olives, which was dismaying to the early colonists who couldn't figure out why they would not manage to do that. Compounding the problem of comprehension of the globe and shifting a way in which science would explain it is the period of global cooling called the Little Ice Age, which extended from the late 1300s into the early 1800s, very, very roughly. Scholars who have examined this climatic episode have correlated it with famine, migration, disease, and war, but not usually with any important shift in natural knowledge. Meanwhile, historians of science have investigated 18th century analysis of weather, of artificial heating and cooling that might adjust for weather, and the circulation of air, which connected the different levels of this problem, though without situating these topics within a context of climate change. So that knowledge, in a sense, has been generated about the period of time that we know the Little Ice Age existed, but without really connecting the dots. And it's Benjamin Franklin's scientific work on climate that helps us to connect those dots. I'm not going to show an image of Franklin. I assume everyone has a general idea of what he looked like, at least over a certain age. No one knows what he looked like when he was younger. But his eventual conclusion that climate in the Northern Hemisphere was colder than it had been in the remote past is striking, that he saw that historical change. So too was his related assertion that weather occurred in irregular and complex patterns, as in Atlantic storm systems and in the Gulf Stream, which he would eventually chart. So, climate for him and for a growing number of his contemporaries was not simple and static, but instead complex and mutable, occurring longitudinally and latitudinally. Franklin's theories resulted from decades of experiments and observations on patterns of thermal variation. And his famous stove, actually originally a fireplace, represented his first moment of experimental insight. It provided heat for the first small atmosphere that Franklin investigated, a room within a house, which became the crucial model for how he interpreted heat and motion within the larger atmospheres of the natural world. More than a practical device, the fireplace or stove was Franklin's scientifically informed attempt to solve what he thought were two temporally related problems. First, a pattern of historically atypical cold weather, and second, the concomitant threat of future deforestation as the British colonial population grew in size and demanded ever more firewood, possibly altering the climate as they did so. Here's where I should point out that this is very much an early modern perspective, given its emphasis in Franklin's writings on somatic criteria, bodily sensation, as well as technological criteria to determine the present and future good of humanity. A high modern perspective would assume a separation between humans and nature. But in a historical era when the separation was partial and porous, Franklin defined the human body as a natural sensor of nature's variations, more appropriate than any thermometer or other instrument in determining temperature, especially cold. And also, more to the point of this conference, Franklin made an extremely creative connection from the microcosm of the heated rooms that would comfort more human bodies to the macrocosm of the natural world, the larger Earth, one whose climate inflicted cold on human beings but could also produce wood to warm them up, if they took care to conserve the wood. Franklin wanted a better material present that would as well extend into the future. In Franklin's era, in early America, the solution to cold was wood. In his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, Franklin commemorated the terrible winter of 1732 with The Rape of Fuel, a cold weather poem. In the poem, the poorest settlers, made desperate by their wants, had to go shuddering forth in early hours and late to steal firewood. In the dark, the thieves took anything burnable. Oh, I'm so sorry. There, you have the text. The thieves would take anything burnable: bald, antiquated oaks and bark-shed gums, mansions, untenable, dismantled barns, storm-shaken fences, thin, broad rails, oblique, distorted post gates clad with dismal moss and rotted, rooted stumps, anything that they would tear up or out at dead of night and take home and burn. Another few days of heat stolen to save a wretched life, as Franklin put it. Kind of evocative. I wish it were colder. We're doing this a little too late in winter, perhaps, for us to go shuddering forth in sympathy. Several other pieces in the Pennsylvania Gazette, while Franklin was still actively publishing it, noted dire winters in subsequent years, as in 1740 to 1741. The paper in that year related that accounts from all parts of the country are filled with complaints of the severity of the winter, no one remembering the like. The cattle are daily dying for want of fodder. Many deer are found dead in the woods, and some come tamely to the plantations and feed on hay with other creatures. By spring, the paper would report that backcountry settlers were reduced to eating the carcasses of starved deer as they thawed out. That winter, 1740 to 41, was a turning point. It was the event that prompted Franklin to do his first recorded scientific experiment on the movement and dissipation of heat, and culminating in his first invention, the so-called Franklin stove. Amid the alarming news of the freezing cold in 1741, Franklin warned that the cold was driving up the price of fuel. An advertisement for coal in the same February issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette explained that at 18 pence a bushel, it was cheaper fuel for hearth firing than wood at the present rates, yet the price kept going up, a warning. The paper then gave the first published reference to Franklin's invention. On December 29, 1742, Franklin announced to his readers, "To be sold at the Post Office, Philadelphia, the new in-place Astor Almanac, also a center in which he would sell any new invention, characteristically efficient of him." 2 years later, in 1744, Franklin printed a description of the fireplace. His account of the new invented Pennsylvanian fireplaces cites 3 scientific texts. Nicolas Gauget, La Mécanique du Feu, first published in French in 1713 and translated into English by J.T. Desaguliers as Fires Improved, a first edition of 1715, and this is probably in a later edition of 1736, that was probably the one Franklin read. The second work would be Desaguliers' own System of Experimental Philosophy, which told you how to investigate the natural world using approved Newtonian methods. And then third, Martin Clare's Motion of Fluids, first published 1735, but Franklin probably read an edition from 2 years later. So it's an interesting promotional pamphlet describing an invention that has scientific footnotes to these 3 authors. But unlike any of these sources, Franklin neither used instruments to detect heat, even though he was running an experiment with heat, but he didn't use instruments to detect heat, nor did he regard winter, unlike his sources, merely as a static if recurring hazard. Yes, it comes every year, but it's the same. Rather, in contrast to this literature, he used bodily senses to measure heat, and he defined weather in terms of climate as part of a larger and dynamic hemispheric pattern that did not have mere seasonal variation or recurrence. At the very start of Pennsylvania fireplaces, Franklin explained that in these northern colonies, the inhabitants keep fires to sit by generally 7 months in the year. That is, from the beginning of October to the end of April, and in some winters near 8 months by taking in part of September and May. Franklin's acknowledgement of spatial variation, north versus south, was immediately followed by a warning about the temporal consequences of heating. Wood, our common fuel, which within these 100 years might be had at every man's door, must now be fetched near 100 miles to some towns, and makes a very considerable article in the expense of families. That mile-per-year calculation as the forests receded was ominous, particularly as colonial settlements grew, yet contended with long, cold American winters. The time and space variables spelled future cost, if not disaster, for people who are going to have to heat their fireplaces with more and more expensive fuel, even as the winters might not moderate. As therefore so much of the comfort and conveniency of our lives for so great a part of the year depends on the article of fire, since fuel is become so expensive, and as the country is more cleared and settled, will of course grow scarcer and dearer. Franklin continued another very long sentence. Any new proposal for saving the wood may at least be thought worth consideration. Thus, his goal in developing a new fireplace was to maximize the amount of heat produced by the combustion of wood. Franklin's experiment in order to generate such an object was designed for easy replication. His laboratory was a room with a fireplace, presumably a room in his house, and his measure of the fireplace's ability to heat the room were his own physical senses. A room felt warm if it had warm air throughout it, not just near the fire. How that happened required comprehension of 2 essential physical components, air and fire, the latter being a contemporary synonym for heat. Any room was full of air, one had to hope, and air was a fluid or elastic substance that, if warmed, expanded. Conversely, cold air contracted. Anyone could feel the difference without use of specialized instrumentation. So in contrast to Gauget and Desaguliers, Franklin never used the word thermometer, nor barometer for that matter. Gauget, in contrast, mentioned thermometers 11 times in his work. It's actually likely that Franklin, in fact, had a thermometer. Certainly he had one by the summer of 1749. But he did not assume his readers were likely to have them, or frankly, to need them. Instead, his readers could use common household items in order to visualize how air expanded when heated and contracted as it cooled. Take any clear glass bottle, he instructed, and place it before the fire, and as the air within it is warmed and rarefied, part of it will be driven out of the bottle. If the heated bottle were inverted and quickly its mouth placed in a container of water, the motion was apparent. You could still do this. As the air within cools and contracts, you will see the water rise in the neck of the bottle, Franklin explained, supplying the place of just so much air as was driven out. It was more difficult but not impossible to verify how heated air moved within a space larger than a bottle. Franklin moved from this small glass interior to a whole room, one fitted with windows and doors and supplied with an ordinary fireplace that burned up into a chimney. This was not a hypothetical space, sealed against external and interfering air, but a real one, plagued with drafts and therefore complexity. That revealed the interaction of warm air with cold, fresh air coming in through the doors and windows, or, if they be shut, through every crevice, as may be seen by holding a candle to a keyhole. The drafts would continually cool the air in a room, but also send the smoke from a fireplace up the chimney. Without those coalescing cold eddies, the smoke being no longer driven up must come into the room. Now, the nature of these variously heated currents of air could be verified by their effects on the body. The greatest fault of most heating systems, Franklin emphasized, was that they did not actually warm entire rooms. Instead, they were sources where people could go and warm themselves. This meant, Franklin warned, that a man is scorched before while he is froze behind from the drafts that came whistling or howling into rooms. The result was ill health, colds that resulted from drafts, damage to eyes and skin, and teeth from facing open fires. Franklin has a very evocative way of saying that in the northern climates, many a fine set of teeth is ruined by sitting too near fires. If better heating were to be part of an improved human life, the human body, teeth, face, colds, or their absence, these would all be measures of the fireplace's success. Also, fireplaces were wasteful, and here Franklin has thrift endlessly in mind. I will point out in this instance that this pamphlet is produced fairly cheaply. This is not the high end of Franklin's printing business. He clearly meant that people were going to buy and read this. And therefore waste and avoidance of waste was built into the very medium that Franklin was using to promote his fireplace. Ordinary fireplaces were wasteful. The greatest part of the heat from the fire is lost by going straight up the chimney. Thus, 5/6 at least of the heat and consequently of the fuel is wasted, Franklin scolded, and contributes nothing toward warming the room. Franklin recommended his design because it prevented the loss of heat. And here, in case anybody wants to assemble their own, these are the components of the first Pennsylvanian fireplace, which is a modification of an ordinary fireplace by installing a series of plates that would themselves be warmed up, obviously from the fire, therefore able, because they extended into the room, to conduct the heat further without wasting the fuel. Franklin recommended this design because it prevented the loss of heat. The various plates of his fireplace would warm the air, which, becoming specifically lighter than the other air in the room, is obliged to rise. An interior plate closed off part of the chimney, forcing the heated air out into the room, where it rises by the mantelpiece to the ceiling and spreads all over the top of the room. As yet more heated air would flow out from the fireplace, it rose above and pushed down the earlier layers of warmth. Therefore, the whole room becomes in a short time equally warmed. And the measure of that thermal shift was, again, the body that perceived the comfort. The important point was that the fireplace warmed a whole room with less fuel than by any other source of heat. As very little of the heat is lost, much less wood will serve you, which is a considerable advantage where wood is dear. In a footnote, Franklin specified that people who installed his fireplace reported savings in wood from anywhere from 3/4 to 5/6. It depended on how bad their previous fireplace had been. He himself boasted a common room for his family that is made twice as warm as it used to be with 1/4 of the wood I formerly consumed there. By the help of this saving invention, Franklin praised himself, our wood may grow as fast as we consume it, and our posterity may warm themselves at a moderate rate. That saving would extend into the future not only genealogically but spatially. Posterity would not eventually be obliged to fetch their fuel over the Atlantic at what would have been ruinous expense for the poorest members of Philadelphia's population. As he worked on his fireplace, Franklin began to think of heat within larger atmospheres. He concluded that his fireplace operated for a room as the sun did for the entire Earth. And as you can see in this diagram, he ornamented the front of his invention with a small sun and the caption Alter Idem, meaning the fireplace was another one, another sun. Franklin also continued to think about deforestation, not only in terms of future loss of fuel, but also as a potential transformer of the climate more generally. While the commonplace belief among his contemporaries was that the fewer trees, the better, because they cooled the earth and prevented productive agriculture, for instance, but Franklin worried that fewer trees might make summers unbearable. In his Poor Richard Almanac for 1744, he celebrated the lucky landowner in Pennsylvania whose trees in summer yield him shade, in winter fire, the wood in both forms contributing to year-round comfort if wisely conserved. In 1758, Franklin suggested that forests might cool the entire earth, though not because they literally shaded it. Would not the earth grow much hotter under the summer sun, he asked, if a constant evaporation from its surface, greater as the sun shines stronger, did not, by tending to cool it, balance in some degree the warmer effects of the sun's rays? Is it not owing to the constant evaporation from the surface of every leaf, he continued, that trees, though shone on by the sun, are always, even the leaves themselves, cool to our sense? Franklin conceded that the scale of the phenomenon defied easy measurement. When a country is cleared of trees, he admitted, the sun acts more strongly on the face of the earth, the conventional belief. But whether enough of the country in around Philadelphia is yet cleared to produce any sensible effect may yet be a question. He thus re-emphasized the power of human sense to determine an optimal temperature, and even in the case of scientific observations that might rely on thermometrical readings, he questioned the current state of knowledge. Only time will tell. With these, at first, tentative thoughts on fuel, trees, and climate, Franklin was moving outward to investigation of large natural atmospheres. Each time he reused the terms of analysis he had originally defined in relation to an indoor fireplace, which allowed him to explain thermal variation as the product of circulatory systems on a larger scale. And at this point, he was beginning to conjecture extremely large ones that connected continents over entire oceans. His major insight in this regard was that neither weather nor climate occurred in those tidy latitudinal bands that classical geography had insisted on, but instead that weather and climate were complex, a realization that had its insights, its originary insights in his fireplace experiments. In the 1750s, for example, Franklin investigated the storm systems that gusted up the coast of North America. Those sections of air moved rapidly northward from the southwest, moving northward from southwest to northeast, although the winds that carried them blew counterintuitively southward. And he had to figure out why this is the case, why the storm systems were moving north even as the wind seemed to be blowing south. He concluded that it was because the wind was only one force that affected the storms, the other being heat. In the Gulf of Mexico, the air, as he explained, was heated by the sun and being thus rarefied, drifted northward, where it met the chilled and condensed air over the British colonies. The collision made the warm air ascend while the cool draft within descended, each in the opposite direction, warm to the north and cold to the south. The result was a revolving northbound tunnel of air, the same as occurred, he said, in any room with a fireplace. A fire in my chimney, Franklin declared, also created an upper current of heat that met a cooler, lower current of air constantly flowing from the door to the chimney. Same system, small scale, large scale, same thing. About a decade later, in the 1760s, Franklin revisited the topic of storm systems, this time to examine what happened when they blew out to sea. Franklin knew that ships could cross the Atlantic faster by going eastward than they did going west. But why? One of Franklin's cousins, a mariner, suggested a reason. The long passages made by some ships bound from England to New York resulted from their sailing in the middle of the Gulf Stream, which mariners knew about, landlubbers not. And in the middle of the Gulf Stream, mariners had to fight the current and were therefore delayed sailing from Europe over to the Americas if they're crossing the North Atlantic. Franklin and his cousin, therefore, did the first chart of the Gulf Stream in 1769 in order to show ships' captains how to avoid it if they were sailing westward. In subsequent writings on the current, Franklin explained it in relation to the winds that passed over the seas, which had been set into motion by the heating of air, yet again. The Gulf Stream connected air, land, and water in a way that defied the old latitudinal theories of climate. It arced across several latitudes, moving in a trend equally longitudinal and latitudinal, all, again, the effect of a circulatory system in which there was thermal variation. Franklin actually participated in 3 charts of the Gulf Stream. This is the final one, done shortly before he died, published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. And if you notice, he's down in the corner arguing with Neptune. In his various works, Franklin had laid foundations for modern climate science, investigations into the complex systems that generated prevailing climate conditions, as well as specific meteorological events, basic assumptions that continue to be used in climate science. But Franklin did not consider this natural knowledge in isolation from its implications for everyday life for ordinary people, nor from efforts to improve life through adaptation to finite natural resources, even at a time when climate change made conditions worse, hence the demand for ever more expensive fuel. The individual human body's comfort and the attention to how it might be preserved, if not optimized, was at the heart of his way of imagining climate and conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel a little bit cold right now. So our next presenter is our own Erika Naginski. She's professor of architectural history here at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. In her research, she has pursued deep readings of architectural form in Baroque and Enlightenment and early modern aesthetic philosophy, and she has engaged in a variety of topics from public space to critical traditions of architectural history. Her most recent book, Sculpture and Enlightenment, traces the transformation of public art and architecture in an age of secular rationalism and revolutionary politics. Today, her talk will be on the colonial origins of architecture, building the Maison Rustique in Cayenne, French Guiana. Erika, welcome.
I think after watching my colleagues, I'm going to try to figure out the forwarding mechanism for this. I want to say, just before I begin, that I chose to give this talk because it is partly a collaboration with one of our PhD students, with Eldra Walker, who is in France right now, and I thought it would be appropriate to foreground the kinds of intersections that we have. Readers of political philosophy are well aware that the state of nature emerged as a central tenet in those writings of the Republic of Letters which sought to contemplate the pre-civilizational struggle for existence. That tenet was marked by conflicting views. Against the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short life of natural man made famous in Hobbes' Leviathan stood the noble savage evoked by the hero Almanzor in Dryden's restoration drama, The Conquest of Granada. This was not the first foray into primitivism for Dryden, who, as literary critics stress, in his early plays proposed savage figures needing to be tamed. How this dualized view influenced those who would go on to enlist naturalized discourses to explain architecture's origins is hardly straightforward. Architects and critics tended to embrace the so-called soft primitivism espoused by Shaftesbury and Rousseau, yet if the presumption of humanity's innate benevolence helped to shape Enlightenment architectural theory concerning buildings' first appearance and habitation, the premise that the state of nature was to be considered either or simultaneously a state of war or a state of grace remained a profound and thorny issue. Given the presence of this philosophical debate over the course of the Enlightenment, we might want to ask if and how it reverberated in architecture's own sense of its coming into being. Stated simply, what would it mean to set a colonial New World example against the canon set by representations such as this 1753 watercolor by the Scottish-Swedish architect William Chambers, in which primitive building has trees for columns, a woven herringbone pattern set into its pediment, and a pitched thatched roof? Or against Abbé Logier's by now ubiquitous rustic hut, which discovered architecture's first model in trunks and branches. The literature has ceaselessly, tirelessly prioritized Charles Eisen's allegorical frontispiece for the second edition of Logier's treatise on the left over, say, the one produced by Samuel Whale on the right for the English translation, in which labor involved in construction begins to yield something altogether more stable than Eisen's version of things, introducing the notion of enclosure through wall and fenestration. Yet the importance of thinking through the relation between, on the one hand, architecture's origin myths, and on the other, the brutal, complex, and endlessly murky history of colonialism, and the theater of transatlantic encounters between the ostensive civilized and indigenous that it staged, is manifestly underscored, as Stephen Kames reminds us, when we juxtapose Eisen's allegory for Logier's text with the frontispiece and title page vignette Eisen also designed that very same year for the first edition of Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. Here, it is the enlightened Hottentot who decides to return chez ses égaux, that is, who rejects the world of civilized Europe and instead returns to his people and presumably to equality and to the serenity of the simple life. No surprise to find the corresponding allegory on the facing title page, seated this time not near the fragments of the Ionic order, but instead beneath a citation from Aristotle's Politics, quote, "Not in corrupted things, but in those that are well placed according to nature, should one consider that which is natural." To be sure, the primitive hut's appearance as an undecorated shed built in a, quote, simple and rude manner in Claude Perrault's 1673 translation of Vitruvius, and as a structure, quote, that approached the natural in the closest way possible, as the first director of the Royal Academy of Architecture, François Blondel, explained, only intensified questions over architecture's origins. Interpretations of the ancient archetype of the hearth and the pitched roof erected over it as protection debated mimetic associations with nature and the human body, scriptural origins, its status as foundational idea, and elementary geometries, cone, cube, sphere. These interpretations found a mid-18th century culminations, as much in Logier's cabane rustique as in the primitive buildings you see here that Chambers went on to include in his treatise on civil architecture. His plate subjects a trio of examples to the same scale and sets their elevations on the oblique in order to exhibit a typological evolution from the first rude conical shelter to the cubically disposed rough-hewn posts and beams of the flat-roof dwelling, and finally to the fully developed columns, architrave, metopes, and triglyphs of the pedimented upgrade that, quote, gave birth to the Doric order. But what we are aiming for is not what has already been accomplished in Joseph Rickwert's On Adam's House in Paradise, the idea of the primitive hut in architectural history. Rickfert famously evokes the Ovidian parable of Philemon and Baucis's humble cottage, conceived here in 1620 by the Genoese painter Sinibaldo Scorza as a sprawling, flaccid, and low-slung structure. Rickfert then traverses the globe over the course of 5 centuries so as to assert the axiomatic interdependence of ritual and human habitation, from Romulus's Palatine hut to the Japanese tea ceremony. For, as he puts it, the hut has always been, quote, inhabited by a god or a hero. Most commonly, it is a rite of building huts which in some way resembled or commemorated those which ancestors or heroes had built at some remote or important time in the life of the tribe. And in every case, they incarnate some shadow or memory of that perfect building, which was before time began. when man was quite at home in his house, and his house as right as nature herself, end of quote. Alongside or against this all-encompassing view in which the global and the universal seamlessly coexist, we offer an historically circumscribed reading. What would it mean to set those well-known Enlightenment images and texts, Chamber, Logier, as backdrops to another kind of proposal? That is, the kinds of plantations and habitations encountered, imagined, or erected in the colonies, and how these too might have participated in the theme of architecture's primitive in ways that, at least to us, have remained overlooked. The primitive hut we consider stems from the book you see here. The people, buildings, encounters, resources, and modes of production unveiled in Jean-Antoine Brulé-Préfontaine's rustic house for the use of the inhabitants of that part of the equinoxial France known as Cayenne, published in 1763. The book includes chapters and plates describing habitation in French Guiana in the following order: jungle clearing, the disposition of the master's house, the buildings that surround it, local food sources, materials, everyday life, the transportation of goods by canoes such as this one, agricultural production from cotton and cocoa to coffee and mango and indigo, the exploitation of slaves, the enlistment of local tribes, the use of herbal medicines. In short, what Préfontaine, a Marine lieutenant and colonial administrator, had published in 1763 was an instruction manual with the nuts and bolts of how to establish a plantation in an unforgiving Atlantic coastal region of the New World on the basis of a slave economy, local materials, and the remunerated labor of indigenous populations. The date of 1763 is important. To begin with, the 7 Years' War had just come to an end. The outcome was disastrous for the French crown, whose military defeat instigated the relinquishment of vast amounts of territory in India, Canada, and the Americas. The losses were cartographically certified in images like this one, a, quote, new map of North America according to the definitive treaty concluded at Paris, 10 February 1763. This was a period of imperial diminishment that underscored how many in France continued to reject colonialism as repugnant. As the philosophe Bonneau de Mably had explained, quote, there is no doubt that this kingdom can be content and powerful, even very content and very powerful, without colonies, end of quote. In addition, and complicating the picture, was the reality that the French crown was already in the process of pressuring the Jesuits to leave the Antilles, both as a means to make way for continued colonization efforts, and more generally as a precursor to the suppression of the Society of Jesus in France, which was sealed by royal edict in November of 1764. This process of closing the doors of Jesuit colleges, imposing renunciation of vows, and enforcing eventual banishment had in fact already been initiated as early as 1761, specifically in the French island colony of Martinique, where the, quote, Jesuits over time had acquired plantations to achieve a self-sufficient mission since the 1640s when they had first arrived. These were located, as Thomas Kitchen's map of the island shows us, let's see if I can do this, right over here in the Jesuit quarter, or the Basse-Terre of the island, whose access by sea was made possible by Fort Saint-Pierre, erected a century earlier. It is important to keep in mind that, as anthropologists have noted, Jesuit mission work in these colonies took place among enslaved Africans, and a priest called the Curé des Nègres was assigned to oversee conversions and the practice of Catholicism among the slaves. Indeed, by 1761, the Jesuits had been in Cayenne for nearly a century, having landed there in 1666 from the aforementioned Martinique mission. Within 2 years, they had established plantations such as l'Habitation Loyola near Remire, just 10 kilometers south of present-day Cayenne, which they ran with slave labor. Here, the chapel on the left, and the kitchen on the right bracket the entrance to a neatly ordered agricultural compound that included a cemetery of dovecote and the entire apparatus of sugar production, from sugar cane fields to the purgerie or purgery for cutting, shredding, milling, to the storehouse and drying racks called boucan, a French adaptation of a vernacular term. Seemingly humble, this Jesuit domain had in actuality, by the time the French crown repossessed it in 1762, reached an extent of more than 1,000 hectares, with sugar production as its main source of income, along with coffee, cocoa, and the fabrication of artisanal pottery. Such sites and the cycles of production and exploitation they had established brings us to the question of nomenclature, as well as to the question of the historical tradition on which the author of our text drew. What did Préfontaine mean by the maison rustique, or rustic house? In the early modern period, the term simply designated farm buildings and agricultural compounds. A classic of the genre is that described in Charles Etienne's Agriculture and the Rustic House of 1564, for example, which, based as it was on an original Latin edition, the Predicum Rusticum, saw many revisions and translations. Detailing everything from a typology of distillation equipment on the left to the instruments and methods of land survey on the right, the book aimed at nothing less than containing, quote, everything that is necessary for building and maintaining a farmhouse, comprehending and predicting both solar and lunar movements, assessing everything about rustic affairs, curing laborers who might fall ill, feeding and caring for cattle and poultry of all kind, compartmentalizing herb gardens, organizing orchards, making honey and cider, olivinology, laboring the earth, with a brief discourse on nature and discerning the melodic songs of the nightingale, the lark, canary, and all manner of bird, end of quote. By the late 17th century, such treatises revealed an increasingly meticulous approach, moving from a world of wonder and approximation to what the philosopher of science Alexandre Coiré termed a universe of precision, with Louis Ligier's General Economy of the Countryside, or New Rustic House of 1700, for instance, devoting page space to grafting, pruning, and encouraging the fecundity of fruit trees in a scientifically reasoned way. Yet our French Guiana example, which eerily rehearses man's actual search for shelter, community, and culture in a foreign place, stages another sort of genealogy of architectural origins, one that is bound to race, colonialism, trade, and Enlightenment accounts of the civilizational process. And here I turn to some of the work Eldra Walker has been undertaking in order to frame the discursive setting of that genealogy. She considers in this context one of the more curious images of Enlightenment science, the frontispiece of the surgeon Claude Nicolas Leca's 1765 treatise of the color of human skin in general and Negroes in particular. The treatise, which posits that the tint of the human epidermis has an organic and therefore physiologically internal cause, is introduced by a frontispiece engraved after a drawing by the artist Hubert Gravelot, whose epigraph from Virgil's Aeneid describes how the Sibyl's, quote, looks change, her color comes and goes, end of quote. Amid tropical foliage, 4 figures convene. The principal actor, based on her central position, is a white woman in sumptuous dress. Despite the comical touch provided by nudges from a parakeet and a monkey, her countenance is serene. Standing to the left and draped in a loose skirt and blouse, a turbaned woman, Moorish, darkened by the shadows, toils in contemplation. A black man, ready at the rear, is outfitted in servant's attire. His body is engaged, arms extended, brawn visible, and gaze alert. The ruddy man to the right, bearing weapons and a feathered crown, completes the quartet. His twisting frame resolves into a startled expression, apparent only as a mirrored reflection. Overall, the spectrum of skin colors, the assortment of ensembles, and the focused arrangement of bodies ascribe to the image a human hierarchy, which moves from the central figure to the periphery and from the served to the servant. Cultural historian Anne Lafont has interpreted Gravelot's illustration as carrying the cultural and scientific signs of its times while demonstrating the necessary negation, quote, of the African, with Lucas' treatise emerging as a confused alchemy of science and myth, end of quote. While this may be so, more is at work here. Gravelot's compositional arrangement and iconographical choices are addressed in an explanation preceding Lucas' text. This is what he writes, quote, "My intention was to assemble together the three principal types of men, the white, the black, the copper. In order to do this, I placed the scene in America, where they encounter each other quite often. In this way, social function is ascribed to each of the racialized figures. The two women are, quote, white and European, as well as reveal their class difference. The seated woman is a French maîtresse, the woman in charge of the house, and the woman standing to her left is her femme de chambre, or her chambermaid. The man in the back represents Ethiopia, we are told, while filling the function as the maîtresse's laquais nègre, or black lackey. Finally, the warrior to the right represents the Americas and is symbolized by his, quote, copper skin, dress, and armament. The maîtresse, Gravelot tells us, doubles as a négociante, or merchant. As representative of trade, the American examines the sample of European goods displayed at her feet, axes, scissors, paintings, an odd motley crew there. He comes, quote, here for European merchandise, a sample of which is at the feet of the négociante, end of quote. The Ethiopian, perhaps on his mistress's behalf, holds up a mirror to the American, who then, quote, looks upon himself with surprise, end of quote. Gravelot's image in this curious game of foreign glances and self-recognition produces hierarchies of race, class, and nation by means of the concept of transaction, which is expressed literally as the commerce between figures. It is difficult not to see a refraction enacted by the very object of the mirror of an ambiguous trope of French courtly culture in the context of absolutism. As Madeleine de Scudéry wrote in 1671, quote, like mirrors are more or less esteemed, for whether they represent the objects in front of them well or badly, one might say that glory is true or false, in the respect that there is an image in the minds of men based on merit, end of quote. Mirroring likeness or dissimilarity, Gravelot's frontispiece, by construing national and continental identity as epidermal difference, likewise inserts itself into the canonical tradition of the allegory of the four continents, in which personification serves to represent the old and new worlds. In this regard, it is interesting that the landscape unfolding a setting is identified by Gravelot as America, the place, quote, where the races meet quite often. Thus, an ensemble of emblematic objects is situated in an environment that, as he describes it, quote, designates a habitation in the New World, a rustic tent pitched on a banana tree, and another kind of American tree and a hut placed in the distance, end of quote. Indigenous plants and local dwellings suggest a manner of inhabiting the New World that begins as an imagined encounter between races in a French upper-class household, then takes us to American shores only to suggest hypothetical transatlantic commerce. In practice, such exchanges hardly unfolded as gracious conversation. As we now turn to Préfontaine and the plates engraved for him by Nicolas Chalmondrier, we should keep in mind that he had spent over 2 decades in Cayenne, running a sugar plantation with 62 slaves and a ranch with 120 head of cattle. This is, we're going to get into the question of scale. Thus, his Maison Rustique serves firstly as a speculative proposal made in 1762 to take definitive possession of a small area in a region he felt held great agricultural and economic promise. Essentially, he wanted to set up the ordered plantation compound you see here, outfitted with some 50 houses and spaces of production near the Maroni River. In this sense, his project functions as a colonial precursor to Claude Nicolas Ledoux's Royal Salt Works, as we shall see. Secondly, Préfontaine's book must be understood as a guide to be followed in its principles and not only its specifics. This is exactly what it became after Louis XV's minister, the Duc de Choiseul on the right, decided to embark on a venture that completely dwarfed the scale of Préfontaine's original proposal of 300 colonists. Eager to reestablish France's prestige and influence following the humiliating defeats at Rosbach and Crefeld, he had been drawn into the idea of French Guiana by enthusiasts such as Étienne-Henri Turgot, elder brother of the famous physiocrat and champion of economic liberalism Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, as well as the botanist Thibaut de Champvallon. Champvallon was a member of the Academy of Bordeaux, whose works included a study of the flora, fauna, and native inhabitants of Martinique. Both Turgot and Champvallon were to play important roles in the Guiana expedition, with the former serving as incompetent governor from afar and the latter as doomed intendant in situ. With the project launched at the expense of the Crown, Préfontaine's Maison Rustique was subsequently published in 1764 with, in appendix, a concise dictionary of key words of a major indigenous language and distributed to the concessionaires and would-be migrants who had sacrificed their lives and belongings to the hugely dubious quest. They had all been promised some land, provisions for basic necessities, and some 2 years of subvention. And finally, Préfontaine's book serves as a primary source for a calamitous event, the colonization process in French Guiana, which resulted in the deaths from typhus, dysentery, and yellow fever, this within a few months, of a motley assembly of some 10,000 concessionaires, soldiers, artisans, laborers, petty criminals, prostitutes, orphans, peasants from Alsace, Bavaria, Ireland, Malta, and Acadia, as well as an unreported number of Amerindians, African slaves, and white slaves from the Mediterranean. Not, in other words, the story told by the anonymous painter of this work, entitled Colonial Scene, which places the governor of the Guiana expedition, Turgot, who spent barely a few months in the colony only to rush home to the safety of his Normandy estates, at the center of a pastoral encampment as gifts are exchanged in his honor. Utopian speculation, practical guide, tragic history. These constitute the diverse set of functions in which Préfontaine's version of the primitive hut is embroiled. Ultimately, what we have here is the problematically idealized antipode to the disastrous attempt to colonize, in the name of imperial revival and ambition, an extensive Atlantic coastal region of South America nestled between land claimed by the Dutch and the Portuguese. French Guiana, whose contours were described in an official map drawn up by the talented hydrographer and cartographer of the New World, Jacques-Nicolas Belin, for the Ministry of the Navy in 1763. Why Guiana, with its fan-shaped delta, vast areas of wetlands, torrential rainy seasons, and difficult yet unprotected points of access? Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the British, Dutch, and French had recurrently subjected the region to volatile and, for the most part, unsuccessful colonization campaigns. It was in this context that the Europeans encountered some 20 different Amerindian tribes, with a predominance of the Kalina Indians, or the so-called Galibis, captured here in a vignette from Pierre Barrere's 1743 account of equinoxial France, which underscores the gendered aspect of a hunter-gatherer society. Their ostensibly primitive hut was called the Carbet, or Carbet, by the French. And its variable typology included on the left the tabouis, or low-slung triangular single-story structure, 2 to 4 meters wide by 15 to 20 meters long, with a thatched roof and a floor fashioned from palm tree trunks. On the right, the sura, or case haute, essentially an elevated version of the latter set on pilotis and accessible by means of a ladder to ensure against flooding as well as to ward off insects and animals. Described by Barrère and later the cartographer Belin, the open-air interior with suspended hammocks and the facilitation of collective living, some 20 families per structure, would continue to haunt the 19th century ethnographic imagination. As here, for instance, in an 1867 depiction of curved carbets along the banks of the Maroni River where Préfontaine had envisioned the plantation. Meanwhile, slavery, that is, the importation of African slaves, had been introduced to the region in the mid-17th century, with, for instance, the British ultra-royalist Major Anthony Rouse leaving Barbados to found in 1651 Fort Willoughby at the tributary of the Suriname River and installing 500 sugar plantations with 1,000 white workers and 2,000 slaves. In 1664, the French momentarily laid claim to the region thanks to a flotilla of 5 ships carrying 1,200 colonists who would go on to exploit the production of cotton, sugarcane, coffee, vanilla, and dyes like indigo and annatto. But everything fell into British hands once more. The real issue is that what was to become French Guiana would remain for the 17th and much of the 18th century a contested backwater, and its participation in the slave trade as a result remained somewhat minimal. This mostly because the Jesuits, who did participate in the purchase of slaves and whose compound at the mouth of the Kourou River you see right there, set to the north of the Carbet of the Indians, see what you see right there, had remained a relatively small, if enduring, and successful presence in small parishes spread throughout the region ever since their arrival in the 1660s. Nevertheless, where the French slave trade was concerned, this involved famously the triangular trafficking circuit. Ships loaded up with goods departed mainly from the Atlantic ports of Nantes and Bordeaux for the Gulf of Guinea off West Africa, traded in their cargo for African men, women, and children, brought in from regions corresponding to present-day Gabon, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Benin, among other places, and then headed off to the Americas where they were sold. Having switched bodies for cargo, the slave ships returned to the European continent with money and colonial products, which were a key source of information also about the geographic lineaments of coastlines and the accessibility of outposts. This was the kind of information that was amassed and ultimately rendered possible the French landing engineered by Choiseul, Turgot, and Champvallon. A view of the scene after a drawing made in situ by a Spanish officer records well-dressed men and women disembarking at one of the tributaries of the Orinoco Delta to establish the colony in the port of New Cayenne. The image exemplifies a recurrent theme in the print culture of 1763, the heroic disembarkation of the French in Guyana. In the far background, you see the coast of Suriname with a Spanish fort on its banks, and interesting for our purposes, a contrast posed in the caption between the so-called cabins of the coastal fishermen and, quote, the caverns of the savages. Cast as a guide to colonization, Préfontaine's text revealed ambitions that emerged as much in its dedication to Choiseul as in the claim that it would be, quote, useful for the habitants of Cayenne and for the colonies more generally, end of quote. What kind of model for protection, survival, and civilization did Préfontaine's compound on the banks of the Maroni proffer? To what degree was it generalizable? In more than one sense, the introduction reads as the colonialist version of Logier's secular parable of the rustic hut, in which after finding himself scorched by sun, wet by rain, and cold in a dark cave, quote, man is resolved to make good by his ingenuity the careless neglect of nature, end of quote. Here is Préfontaine's version of the parable. Imagine, he writes, a man who is a concessionaire arriving to Cayenne to become its inhabitant. Does he want to depend only on himself? He must procure several slaves with whom he will be able to build on the land granted to him a carbet in the Indian manner, all the while observing 3 separate zones, one to house the slaves, one to store the food, and one to house himself. At the same time, he will plant for his subsistence, and while awaiting the maturation of his crop, he will trade with the Indians for what he needs. He will also find fruit native to the land as well as fish and hunt." End of quote. Astonishing here is not only the architecturalization of the Europeans' impending dominance through 3 zones of separation, one to house the slaves, one to store the food, one to house himself, but also the enslavement of the African and how it is co-opted into and naturalized by the Edenic parable of bounty and promise. And of course, nothing of this can be sustained without the anthropologically observed gestures of indigenous food production, how to scrape, press, and sift cassava for flour, or how to crush the awawa fruit so as to make a kind of soup. Alongside these strategies for sustenance is a hierarchy moving from black to brown to white, from the subjugated to the trading partner to the master. And so the move to true habitation is seemingly self-evident. Quote, "Soon he will dream of constructing a more permanent establishment to form a habitation. What we mean by the word habitation is a certain expanse of terrain of a predetermined width and length that one holds as property, following the terms of a concession given by the king. When it has been either neither cleared nor cultivated, we call it in Cayenne naked earth or standing wood, because it is covered over with a forest that nature has placed here in a haphazard way. The site he has chosen is filled with brush, plants, bushes, trees. One must clean the place." End of quote. The passage paints a stark contrast between the all-powerful paragonic expression of the civilized world, the king's benevolent concession, and the image of brute disordered nature, whose transformation lies in the claim to private property, which must be cleared. How to clear away the disorder is exemplified by the right-hand side of this plate, which displays the local strategy for cutting down trees with high roots by means of a platformed scaffolding called by the natives a boucan. In other words, a structure like the one identified by the Jesuits for drying sugar. The allegorical image of clearing out dense forest stands in for the conditions of architectural possibility in a locale in which Préfontaine reminds his readers wood is, quote, "really the only resource for building, which the country offers in abundance," end of quote. For ultimately, what emerges from the clearing is not only a crucial building material, but also a not so gently vehicled physiocratic instantiation of the idea that one's social status is not determined by birth, as it would be in France, but by what one can produce in this new land. As the economic historian Ronald Meek explains, quote, "The physiocratic theory of consumption was yielded only in agriculture, the mainspring of the country's economic life and the key to its increasing prosperity," end of quote. Thus, if Turgot, in his Letters on the Grain Trade, advocated a system of leases that guaranteed, quote, "an increase in wealth of the class of farmer cultivators," end of quote, French Guiana, with its concession plots and temporary subventions under the supervision of his elder brother, became a microcosm of that system, whose immediate objective it was, and I cite Turgot again, quote, "to increase the amount of produce to the benefit of the entire state, for the profits of the cultivators are not squandered on luxuries, but rather placed in the national debt," end of quote. In this lay the utopian myth. In French Guiana, the physiocratic principles of economic liberty, maximized through agriculture, are held in delicate and strange balance with the royal authority that renders it all possible. Cotton, we are told by Préfontaine, is the easiest to produce and the most profitable, while sugar requires far more expense, accoutrements, and spaces of production. This is exemplified in the section on the left for a sugar mill, whose blades, cylinders, and gears flexibly allow for the use either of wind power or horses for their rotation. From the maison to l'habitation. One's house, as a result, has become the form of social hierarchical organization we call the plantation. And indeed, to consider a plate like this one is to witness the primitive hut metamorphose into an efficient system for agricultural exploitation and storage. At the upper left, signposted by the letter A, is Préfontaine's rendition of the ordinary indigenous house, the famous carbet of the Galibis, with its pilotis and pitch triangular roof held together by jungle vine and not a nail or mortar in sight. Its craftsmanship and open-air principle are shown in plan as well as longitudinal and latitudinal section. Next to it, on the right, signposted by the letter B, the basic carbet structure has morphed into a warehouse for the storage of cotton, this time adorned with white iron godets, as though more industrial methods of organization needed ornament to announce its impending arrival. And finally, version C below and to the left, in which the carbet finds, quote, new form, end of quote, so as to produce the red-orange pigment from roucou, or the annatto seed of the so-called lipstick tree. Here, troughs and boilers on the right and molds surrounded by storage space on the left sit theatrically at the center of a hippodrome-like space. Perhaps the most spectacular incarnation of the carbet is the new sugar manufacturing plant proposed by Préfontaine. It had to be new, because, as Préfontaine explained, sugar was, quote, the most considerable fabrication of the Americas. It requires the most human labor, vast establishments, and so many other different yet inseparable parts that if the one who establishes such a manufacture does not link everything together and make certain that all the different parts work in concert, the enterprise will languish and fail, end of quote. Showcasing organized complexity, the detailed description not only reads like a plate out of the great Encyclopédie, but also, more dramatically, promulgates a vision of the early modern factory whose basic geometries and materials emerge from the very origins of architecture found in an intractably colonial context. Here, the carbet morphs into a longitudinal monster, and a specialized body of workers emerges. Charrons, or those artisanal specialists in wood and metal who tend to agricultural machinery, then the carpenters, the forgers, the barrel makers, the masons, the potters, the scrapers, the sifters, the distillers, the apprentices, and, quote, a perfect manager, unquote, to oversee them all. Only in this way can one fix, quote, the art of making sugar, a process that until then was, quote, nothing but a blind practice, lacking tried and true principles, end of quote. The plate consequently illustrates the need to, quote, arrange things in an orderly fashion, and to use the open-air principle of the carbet in order to ensure air circulation and access to water. Above, let me go back. Above, an exterior elevation dominated by the steep pitch of the thatched roof, and an interior plan of the machinery of production. We move from a sugar mill at the left, isolated under its truncated pyramidal cover. We move from that cover and the access point reserved for the charron to the conduit guiding the masticated sugar cane inside, the heating pans, the sugar forms, the sugar piles, the water well, and the distillery for eau de vie at the right. All is encased on two sides by a viewing gallery. Below, a longitudinal section matched up with the elevation at top details the descending levels and gradations, as well as views of a storehouse by the river's edge, readying sugar for transport. A glimpse into the underground cellar, a bird's eye view of the T-shaped structure, the storage space under the eaves with a canoe at the ready, a profile cut showing the juncture with the hillside, and an elevation of the entrance. To compare this with the visionary architect Ledoux's Royal Salt Works from a little over a decade later is to foreground the rationalized arrangement of the early modern factory production line, the need for visibility and control, as well as the sense that habitation in this context likewise takes on a storehouse idea. The workers' dormitory structures are alike, homologized in some sense with the spaces of labor, a double-height entrance, a single-story wings with a high attic space to each side, each of these containing a central hearth and curving in obedience to the hemicyclical principle of the plan, staging a dramatically visible geometry of rusticated cubes and pyramids. That the chaos of the disparate must give way to an organized whole had already been proposed by Préfontaine, who insisted that, quote, because the various buildings of this manufacturing plant must form a common edifice, there must be only one entrance, end of quote. And in the end, Préfontaine's fantasy of the maison rustique, in which a proto-industrial ethos of labor collides and coalesces with the French country house, formal gardens, and cattle pastures neatly separated from the slave quarters up top and their single water source, leaves us with more questions than answers about the historical relation between Enlightenment architectural theory and the kind of agricultural prosperity envisioned through slavery and physiocrat exploitation in the colonies. For Préfontaine, just as for Ledoux later, the visibility of those who were subjected to the system was essential. Quote, the house of the slave, including 2 separate private zones, is 36 feet long by 12 feet wide. Each slave has his particular house, either for himself, his wife, or his children, or just for himself. Slaves are often housed haphazardly, and this can result in great inconveniences. The best would be to arrange them so that they can be seen from the master's house, arranged in 2 lines, end of quote. The barbarism of efficiency. Precisely because the plantation amplifies so clearly the hierarchy of race, visibly triangulated as much in the layout of the residential working compound as in basic human relations, one cannot help but wonder at the seamless co-option of the primitive hut as form generator, as an adaptive structure allowing simultaneously for protection and production, and to conclude, as an architectural axiom that oscillates dangerously between the desire for origins and the desire for domination. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I now invite our speakers to join us at the table with Catherine Ingraham. She's a professor of architecture and urban design at Pratt Institute, and she will be moderating the discussion. Oh, she stepped out for a second, so let's wait.
Erica here.
It worked, it did.
Sorry, Erica, to walk out on you in the last 3 seconds of your talk.
That's okay.
I didn't know you were going to be at LIMS. Great. All 3 talks, totally terrific, in my opinion. And I don't really, my first impulse was to try and gather these talks into, under the heading of utopia discussion, and clearly each one of them seemed to me to express a configuration that could be considered to be utopic, depending on what terms of the utopic idea we're trying to coalesce and so forth. I was kind of making a little checklist based on your original list, I guess, and I didn't get as far as I wanted to. I didn't get into intentionality, although it might come up, but site scale embodiment and what were and there were, I had this, I kept going back to the authorship intentionality. So I was trying to make a little checklist and with each talk to organize that that idea of the locale of the sort of utopic vision, or the locale, or or the stimulus for a sort of utopic desire or scene. And I could find that in every one of these talks in really fascinating ways. I think the hardest thing to identify, and there's so much I have many questions about each presentation, but the hardest thing to identify was in fact where we would look for since the title of this section of the conference is about embodied utopias, where we look for the concentration of the embodiment itself. And typically we say body, but it's not always a human body or a physical body that actually embodies the utopic, the force of the utopic kind of whatever we're calling it, utopic scene or utopic gesture or utopic imperative. I think utopic impulse. So at first it starts out to be a body. I mean, everybody's talking about different players and in these scenes, different authors, different Benjamin Franklin, you know, as the sort of as a historical repository of tremendously interesting scientific sort of sensibility, and as well as Carlos Lasso. Carlos Lasso, the architect who concentrates in his imagination the the highway or the restructuring of Mexico as the center of a global system, or in the case of Prefontaine, the concentration of the Maison Rustique as a kind of, in his imagination of what that would be, he concentrates a kind of, again, the utopic impulse. But I actually I discovered that it's true, the history of these people and what they write and what they think, we wouldn't have any grip on the situation if we didn't pay attention to them. On the other hand, it seemed to me that the things that they do and fabricate and imagine and map are in fact have to also contain something or embody something of that utopic ideal. This is the typical utopia spatial social dilemma, is it's not just imagining a kind of mirroring real life in some other place, but it's also having to equip that place in a certain way and with certain kinds of things and certain sorts of functions that actually take over the meager influence of the personal and inflate it in a way, amplify it into a big, big cosmic social project or a big historical project or a big event spectacle. So it seems to me, and so I was trying to identify something that could carry the weight of that in each of the talks. I mean, they're sort of obvious in a way. They come up early as obviously the fireplace, obviously the glass bottomed airplane, and in Erica's presentation you could say, well, I guess it's actually the Maison Rustique, the sort of specific example possibly of that. And so everything is cited and somehow run through these ironic these tropes of some sort for what's going to bear the weight of a utopic proposition. It seems to me that once you design something like a glass-bottomed airplane, for example, that you immediately adopt a sort of potential for aerial view. That was the desire. And that the aerial view then results in all the apparatuses of mapping of the territory and the possibility of connecting the Amazon rainforest, with other urban settlements and so on. And it seemed to me that when you invent the fireplace to expand the thermodynamic power of the circulation of heat through the room, that you and contend with the weather of the room, that you are already into massive weather systems, just as you were articulating, that your next step is to study, cosmic weather or something, or the movement of the Earth in relation to wind and wind currents and heat differentials. And so it's, Erica's conversation, I got very interested in a completely separate subject, but I think it's related. And I wasn't looking in her lecture ultimately for the repository of utopic vision, but I got distracted at the beginning again, as I always do, by the primitive hut problem, and exactly the problem that her work was trying to unpack in colonial terms and other ways. And at the very end, you were mentioning, and this is totally just because I'm working on this subject that I always am posing this question, but you mentioned at the end this sort of issue of private property, and it seemed as underlined the sort of architectural potential, the rival of architecture in the midst of, let's say, a so-called primitive landscape. And it seemed to me, again, going back to the primitive hut, and the maison rustique as a sort of new relationship to that, the interesting thing about the two frontispieces you showed, one where people were working and the other where people were at leisure, which was the primitive hut story is always, Logier's story is always a story of leisure and the movement of leisure into the forest during the rainstorm, and then the building of a shelter against the rain. And I always see that move in a way as from a state of nature to real estate in a sense, because you're actually moving, you're sort of then constructing something, but it's fairly loose there. But the other frontispiece, it introduces actual a vision of labor, begins to pin it down in a very particular way. And this is a Lockean notion of definition of property, is that you are entitled to property because your labor, your physical labor delivers the right to you. If you are picking something up and using it, it is by rights yours. And so it originates in Locke in that way. And so the introduction of labor then to site becomes really, really crucial. So I began to think that really what happens, in some sense, I'm thinking of responding to Erica's just exclusively for the moment, is that it's the entry into, it's very, I'm sorry, this isn't more developed, but it's sort of, has something to do with the utopic vision lies in the possibility of actually I have to back up to the property question again. The big right in property over time became the right to exit the agreement. In other words, the right to exit a social system where that had been constructed around you, and that was why private property became more alienable in the New World, because it was a way of getting out of certain kinds of restrictions when property was tied to sovereignty in feudal England. So it was so that release from the social system has to do with the right of exit. And the right of exit is always, in some senses, going on the utopian structure. You're trying to structure an exit from the existing system, and in trying to escape from that existing system, you are seeking, in a certain sense, a sort of colonial occupation of another scene where you can determine your own boundaries and your own installations. So the right to exit is actually at work in colonialism, I think, and it had to do with people going to other countries in order to actually get very free land, essentially, and to take that land and then to establish it in a European sense so that it actually had the rights the depth of right that European property felt it had, and to give it a legal sort of simulacra of legal ownership through labor. By asking, by having slaves who would work the land, and then that you lay claim to it in a way. And everything about the agricultural house supports that development of the deeper claim. Or you could call it, this is such a big subject that I'm, leaving a lot out here. But so that seemed to me to be simultaneously utopian, and yet seeking that abstract principle of grounding that certain kind of real world legal system of claim or whatever it is allows. So again, I'm sort of having to riff on three fabulous presentations, but it strikes me that the interesting containment of either different apparatus. So in a way, I would say in Erica is that it's embodied in the land as opposed to the maison rustique, and that the embodiment is somehow about the land, and the status of the land, and the status of the land as it is. Slavery is brought to work the land in relation to the settler from Europe. So those three things, the fireplace, the land, and the airplane, seem to me to be very interesting points of entry into the right to escape, in a sense, the right to exit. So I would like some feedback on that until
I'm just going to jump in because you've got my brain sort of going furiously in a bunch of directions, and sort of actually redirect some of what you said to you as well, because as I was hearing you speak, and hearing you elaborate on the right to exit, I was thinking about the canonical tradition of utopia in the West. And one of the things that's always struck me is that when you look at that history, when you look, say, at the Plan of St. Gall from the 9th century, the Carolingian monastery, which is a sort of first image of that, or in the Renaissance, ideal cities that are based on fortification, it's actually it's the opposite of the right to escape. It's the right to be sort of enclose yourself in a wall and be defensive and kind of paranoid. It is a certain kind of escape, but it's introverted. But these are all utopias of need, of necessity. Essentially, utopia in those contexts works to provide exactly what you need, because you don't have an industrial revolution, you don't have technological revolutions, which the fireplace begins to do. And what's so curious, I think, about these three papers is that the fireplace, thinking about climate change, thinking about a sort of new vision of machines that can, act as a microcosm or a macrocosm of global climate patterns, say in your case, or in your case that the university becomes a kind of global system of circuits of knowledge production. It occurs to me that the Enlightenment, or maybe the beginning of this period that you isolated, is right at the edge of the Industrial Revolution, in our cases, firmly in it, or post-industrial in your case, that you have this historical bracketing of the transformation of a utopia of need into a utopia of desire. And that suddenly there's this emerging possibility that utopia can be anything you want. That's certainly what Préfontaine is fantasizing crazily about in French Guiana, right? It's this sort of free-for-all zone in many ways, right? The right to escape, for Préfontaine, but I'm also thinking here, and it's so funny to come around full circle, and maybe we'll get some of this in the second panel, whereby we've actually come back to a period with the reality of diminishing resources, with sustainability and all of that, where maybe we're turning back to an early modern model of utopias of need. And I just think about that circuitry. I think it's a complex, it's a longue durée, of course, but I think it wraps into a kind of coherence what we are, each in our own way, are trying to do here. And Catherine, what I like about what you said here is that it does seem to me that at least the physiocrats and their conception of property goes hand in hand with the beginning of the switching of the, flicking the switch into the possibility that utopia might be fantasized as a utopia of desire and not simply a utopia of necessity. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I didn't think so
Yeah.
much in terms of escape, I must say. Because I'm thinking again about the poem that Franklin publishes about people who have to go shuddering forth out in the cold to get the wood, to get home, so they don't die. And it's a kind of caloric calculation that you do need a certain amount of food if it's cold, and if you're not going to get that amount of food, you need to keep warm. So this is what they're tearing up and then sneaking back home. So I saw it as if there's a utopia, I think there is a kind of, at least age of improvement utopian vision here of inclusion. Come into the warm room, everyone. And the inclusion would involve a kind of network. So going back to, how this vision of improvement is going to be shared. Franklin very much is writing letters. The pamphlet, the Stove pamphlet, is translated into 2 languages, first Dutch, and then it kind of redundantly comes back to Pennsylvania. In Dutch, it's translated into French, and the knowledge itself circulates. And is commented on. Franklin also points out that when he goes to London, he installs his fireplace. Of course he does. He goes to a London iron merchant and has all the equipment replicated. And then he claims that other people in London imitate that. So there's, again, a sense that the technology is supposed to spread and more people be familiar with it. The correspondence he has with Lord Kames is part of 2 correspondences he has with contacts in Scotland who also imitate the fireplace. So it's spreading into the north where they really need it. So in a sense, the knowledge and the technology circulating just as the air is supposed to. And in a sense, that is the inclusive thing, that the number of rooms in which it's warm and comfortable are replicating.
In terms of desire, obviously the cases that I'm describing are all the devices I'm looking at are obviously kind of supplementary ones that serve at least a couple of purposes. There's the idea that these are all unfinished national projects, and that these national projects inherit both in terms of the geographies of influence that they imagine and in terms of the scope at which they are articulated, these older geographies that you were describing very clearly of the kind of the colonial imaginations that accumulate and overlap with the national projects that all the state formations I'm looking at are trying to enlist architecture to do some kind of work for. So it is interesting that there's a lot of resonance in terms of the ways in which these technologies that are deployed in my case are very obviously about kind of renewing social relations and very radically altering territorial relationships. But there's something profoundly kind of restorative about them too, because they're all meant to return back to some kind of imagined order that once existed in terms of a geographical order or in terms of an even kind of budding ecological conception of things. And in terms of thinking about how my story extends to the present, it is very interesting to think about the role that the Amazon plays in the world's imagination in terms of the current the history of how that's been imagined as what kind of terrain it's been. At the time that I'm looking at it, it is the moment, which is a really important moment when it shifts from a territory of an older conception of it as a kind of empty territory to be circumvented and not ventured into, but nonetheless a source of great deal of temptation, which is a long way of a long kind of duration way of imagining the Amazon, to its kind of status in the present world still as a kind of terrain for a number of conflicts that have involved the the trade I was talking about, the cocaine trade and the war on drugs, its best friend, and to the more recent imaginations of the Amazon as a kind of reservoir for utopian impulses of scarcity in the present, as a kind of hope for the salvation of the universe and the world. So there is a way in which all of these devices and technological artifacts and infrastructural devices are mired in a kind of a series of overlapping conception of what utopia can mean. But clearly there's a supplementary function that they all serve at least in my case studies.
If I could just also add, I really like the idea of scarcity as a guiding principle for the kinds of things we were examining, but paradoxically we were all looking at the Americas. where that's not supposed to be the case. That's where everything is better, cheaper, more abundant. So I think that the curtailing of that imaginary is really, really important.
But wasn't the problem of the Americas that, in fact, the original colonists almost died of starvation because they didn't know how to work the land. They didn't know how to use anything in America. And so the discovery is of how to begin to retool America and how to use it in ways that were not unlike these sort of colonial settlements, which had to do with indigenous people who were very knowledgeable and borrowing against their knowledge, and also trying to reestablish the roots of settlements in some way that actually could equip themselves.
It is ironic that you have these 2 episodes of starving times in the British colonies, but they're blips against the big fantasy that the stuff, manna rains from the skies. And the whole development of especially tropical regions is all about that fantasy that sadly, tragically, for a while works.
Well, the tropics
but then
are
the
a temperate
abundance
climate.
as well. So
Yeah.
Franklin is also simultaneously theorizing the abundance of land in North America and how quickly settler population can grow at historically unprecedented rates. But he obviously sees the problem. He says, that's great in some ways, but you're going to run up against material scarcity eventually, which is what he's talking about with the deforestation, that he says, we're becoming the dominant force in North America. On the other hand, we're running out of firewood, which in an era when that was it, again, it was what stood between you and death in a northern climate. It wasn't a small concern.
And of course, in French Guiana, you are clearing it as fast as possible in order to survive.
But I think it matters that the climate in the tropics was temperate. In other words, you could afford to fail to some degree in sort of settlements and agriculture, but you could afford to fail more than you could afford to fail in northeastern
I think
sites. But you're absolutely right. I understand that the manifest destiny and the fantasy of the sheer amount of land available in the imagination in the United States was unbelievable, and was an engine that drove tremendous, part of both political. And,
the thing that kills people in the New World is
social.
disease. So we would have
Right.
to enter a different dimension in order to understand how that undercuts the fantasies, but it doesn't have to do so much with, say, hunger.
But I just want to say something to Erica's point about desire versus need. And so is there ever, maybe this brings us to the definition of utopia, or what kind of theory of utopia we're following, because essentially, right, are we still in Jameson's view of utopia as an imperative to think, and yet, it's not a representation of a new world. It's actually instructs us in the imperative to think of another world because of the lockdown of our own reality, so to speak. So it is always operating on reality in some way. And not, and the right of exit that I'm talking about is also a kind of, is not a true escape of any kind, it's a desire, but it's not it ends up concocting a world that is not desirable, or in some ways desirable up to a point and then falls apart because it can't, because it's really about this imperative to imagine it as opposed to the scene itself.
So, should we open it up for a few questions before we head out for lunch?
I was just thinking, just to follow along with what you guys seem to be suggesting in a sort of corporate way, that maybe in this context, the embodied utopia is precisely at the intersection of desire and need. So it's where one's needs rub up against one's desires, especially in the context of a place that's, yet to be fully imagined and is already a bit of a utopia like the Americas are?
I think I'm hampered here by two factors. First, there was still a quite negative connotation to utopia in Franklin's era. I mean, they read all of Moore's warnings very seriously as the forefront of that text, and eventually were deeply concerned that the new republic not be described as utopian for that very reason, that it would have been a kind of a negative reading of what their project was. Also, I like that idea of desire and need, but I have to point out that that sounds grand and soaring, and one thing I find Franklin's vision so fascinating is that it's so middle rank. I mean, he was really talking about ordinary people. Sure, he wants the poor to keep from freezing. You know, he is interested in how poorhouses, for instance, will get firewood, so these people don't have to suffer. But it's such a cozy bourgeois vision. So it kind of depends on how you define desire and need in very, for the time and place, contextualized ways.
I'm struck especially between the comparison of Préfontaine and Franklin about ideas of efficiency that are in both of these visions of a future, and so I'm finding myself thinking about the relationship between utopia and efficiency, and how ideas of efficiency in these two examples are towards very different ends, right? One is an efficiency of human labor leading towards the better consumption of resources at a landscape scale. The other is efficiency of concentrating human labor so that there's more production of a resource. So I'm curious to hear in each example about efficiency and how that idea might be playing with colonial or national visions.
I mean, I'm going to sort of lead this off by saying that, of course, the kind of efficiency that Joyce is speaking about is reasoned, scientific, and philosophical, and follows some kind of logic, whereas the so-called efficiency that Préfontaine is instantiating is insane, right? And it's funny, actually, because, it's sort of obvious that one would evoke the Royal Salt Works, but even in that condition, and this is something that's gotten a little bit less attention in the sort of voluminous accounts of that extraordinary site, which is obviously now a World Heritage Site, the extraction of salt had profound impact on the landscapes and sort of turned them into salt marshes and turned arable land into non-arable land. So already there were, sort of fundamental changes by these pre-industrial methods. In other words, these things have a history, and so it was already there was a sort of concern over, say, something like salt, which is in many ways the physiocrat fantasy of the ideal resource because it's coming from the earth and you are what you make, is having disastrous kind of repercussions for landscapes and their fertility. So, it's interesting to think about those lessons in the 18th century and how they do or do not get transposed into a place like French Guiana, where Préfontaine had been there for a while, so he had some sense of how to survive. I think we often leave out the Jesuits, who were extremely successful on a small scale, different kind of operation, but blowing the scale or making that scale utopian was manifestly disastrous, right? So I think those are interesting tensions.
Yeah, but I think the two last questions in some ways match, that it is a part of the cozy bourgeois vision is how you're going to run, whatever improved community you want to create. And people of this generation were entirely serious about that. So there were Franklin fireplaces in Independence Hall, of course. There was just a seriousness of that vision of no detail was too small. And I'm reminded here is a good point to put in the fact that the United States is the first nation created by committee, you know. It is this boring detail that actually had, depending on what you think about the United States, kind of a payoff, I would say. And there is, again, it's not just Franklin. John Adams, probably the most gifted political theorist, certainly of that generation. Nevertheless, he's the guy who's brokering the whale oil going to Paris to light the streets there. You know, they knew their stuff in very crushing amount of detail, really. I don't quite understand it. But that concern, no waste, everyone should be involved, all lives should be improved. There's a way in which they're already tipping into that negative sense of utopia, even in their desire to avoid it. But they do have a lack of patience with the theoretical as an improvement, and they want to know how it's actually going to be done, which is why I kind of imagine the whole set of them from the Continental Congress going down and viewing Brasilia. I think they would have thought, right, there's something akin to the projects here, as horrifying as that time travel would be. That would take more than a glass-bottom airplane to get them all there.
But one more thing about that, it seems to me that the level of detail is bureaucratic and kind of local. It's really true. And yet, at the same time, these massive land proclamations are being made, right? I mean, these are proclamations that nothing holds them down except the proclamation or the ordinance itself, you know? And it's a deeply speculative, projective act. And that comes out of the the organizational details of shaping the grid, obviously, and all sorts of other formative devices that are in the process of working. So those are all theoretical, I would say, kind of theoretical extensions of the sort of local, whatever the details of the committee were.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the question of scale, which I thought was very good, that they're thinking, crossing the Atlantic, crossing the continent, and meanwhile, well, how much firewood do we need for that meeting?
Yeah, the meeting, yeah, that was, but therefore I would say something like the fireplace was, in fact, embodiment of the desire to understand the North American climate or something like that, right? Which is kind of what you were implying. And so it was part of the territorial information that had to be in a sort of, say, proclaimed from a humble base, Yeah. A few people sitting around the table say, oh yeah, let's just get all that land, or why don't we just, maybe the climate, well, we're going to figure out the climate in this massive continent. So it was I don't know if those big sort of formative futures for the country, how again, the embodiment problem for me is where do they get embodied, or how does that, how do you talk about that? I think the meeting of desire and need sounds so right somehow, and yet I'm still a little bit hung up on what kind of interface is that, or is there ever any division between those two, desire and need? I mean, are we really able to all need, I guess this is old news, but all need, is really all mixed up desire. So it's not, so it's not there can be no clean split between those two. And so I just don't know quite how we would theorize that,
As you speak this so eloquently about high theory, I just have the image in my mind of that detail of the plan of St. Gall, where it's very clear that there are no heating vents in the refectory because they don't want the priests to enjoy their food. Oh.
Yeah, one pleasure at a time. You're either warm or you're eating.
You either get fed or you're...
Is that you're pointing to an interface of we really need heat.
Yeah. or you can't have it because we don't want you to.
Right. Well, once you're warm, then you can desire.
Lovely, warm room.
Right.
So thank you for this great conversation. Thanks everyone for coming.